Hey everybody, webinar number 8. Last week we were talking about bluffing and doing fancy things, and so this week we're going to kind of go into the realm of not being fancy, and I want to talk about fancy play syndrome. Sometimes we make really goofy plays, especially me, like doing really weird things that are unconventional, but what's important is that you have control over what you're doing. Race car drivers can drive 100 miles an hour like a pro. Probably not some rando guy on the freeway can't drive like that and have control over what he's doing, right? So it's really important that we, in a way, think like a race car driver and have control over when we do fancy things. So I want to talk about having control versus not having control, regaining control if you lose it, and how that deals with confidence. Mute mic, please. Keeping it simple and talking about the opposite of, if you've heard that expression, actions speak louder than words, and about how in poker words speak louder than actions. Okay, so starting with control versus no control here. I want to just talk about raising pre-flop versus knowing why we raise pre-flop. So a really simple first example. You're three-handed in a $3 rebuy final table. You know, when you see a spot like this, which I'm sure every single person pretty much raises here blind, tell me the reasons why we raise here pre-flop. Because one thing with fancy play syndrome and knowing what you're doing is kind of going back to basics. Why do we raise here? Okay, good. Someone's mic is still on. Good. Be the aggressor. Did I spell that right? No. Great chance to bluff. Position, good. There is ruffling. Someone has their mic on. Oh, did it? How about anything else? How about just the stage of the game? Morton's favorite thing yet again. And just, I mean, how powerful it is here. I can think of one more thing. Momentum is huge at a spot like this. Okay, so at either rate, raising here should be standard pretty much all the time. And I think that's why when Renning Stone watches this back, he's going to be disappointed in that. Because one thing Renning Stone said here is that he doesn't like raising the button because it's too see-through. And I found that really interesting. That's an example of fancy play syndrome, like the mental fancy play syndrome. Someone's mic is still on. Maybe it's just you. Outthinking yourself here is a form of fancy play syndrome. So that's what I think Renning Stone can work on here, is not outthinking himself, because if these guys don't recognize that a button steal is with a very huge wide range of hands, and even if they did, they would have to exploit that actively. And then in this particular game, game flow, the small blind was always giving walks when BBB versus Renning Stone. The other guy was giving walks, although not as often. But when you mix all these together, we can turn this into a raise. Good. So it's good to go back to basics here. And I think that deals with why. Why are we raising here? Well, we look at all of these. But what we can recognize here is that, assuming in situations where we don't flop well, even though this hand is really nice, and ignoring any backdoor outs or backdoor draws, most hands here are essentially what? Good, more people. Ooh. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Hey, Marty. So that's really, really important, because when we recognize that, hands start to become similar. And that's really important. Although 8-9 is obviously much stronger than just a flat 3 deuce offsuit or something like that, because at least you have flop ability with this hand. But when the flop comes ace high, like, ace 7 deuce or something like that, and you're just going to blind, well, not blind, but you're going to c-bet that flop because it's just an awesome flop, you're essentially just bluffing. So that's really, really important. Kind of a straightforward hand, I guess, in raising here. One thing I guess we forgot to mention, what I love, stack depth with an S. Because here, I mean, what do we have? I can't do math. 25, 24 big blinds or something, and everybody else does too. This is a great chance to start getting wider. Okay, but when we raise here, I think we could even raise here with 7 deuce offsuit in a situation. I would obviously much prefer 8-9. But since we recognize if we flop horribly, we're essentially bluffing, then we can start actually having real bluffs. And so sometimes the cards act as illusions. They're tricks. Ooh, 9-8, that looks pretty. It's kind of like the woman, and she's really sexy, and you're like, oh, I want to get with her, but really she's just going to steal all your poker winnings. You know what I mean? It's not what it seems. She's just an illusion. And sometimes cards can kind of act as sexy women, where we go 8-9. It's just so beautiful. But really, maybe it's just a trick. Gold diggers. Okay. So simple hand, but any questions about the why and stuff like that? Well, we already got those. So one more part of this hand. What is your plan post? I guess we already kind of touched on that. You're pretty much going to c-bet lots and lots of flops. I mean, there's 22,100 flops, minus some because you have 2 blockers to an 8 and 9. But most of these flops are c-bettable. A lot of them. C-bet decide. I really like that. That's worth mentioning here. We're c-bet deciding. We're never just c-betting. As interesting comparison. Because a c-bet indicates someone who is doing what they think they have to do, like it's a requirement or something. Yeah, you have to c-bet here. But c-bet and what? C-bet why? C-bet and deciding. C-bet and thinking. Someone's mic is still on. Yeah, exactly. Never c-bet give up. It's really important because now we're in the mental part of fancy play syndrome. If you're just raising and c-betting, it's not necessarily a fancy play on the surface level, because you're just kind of copying what you think you have to do. Someone who is c-bet and thinking about flop textures and doing different things and playing, like bluffing if they sense it's okay to do it, that seems like fancy play. Like if we posted a hand in a forum where we raise here and someone calls and then they donk bet the flop and we raise with 9 high to bluff, that seems like fancy play on the surface. But if the core reasoning beneath, that behind the scenes stuff, so to speak, if we know why we're doing something and sense that it's an okay spot, that's not necessarily fancy play syndrome. When people look at Tom Dwan, who is like an absolute amazing player, it looks like he's just dripping in fancy play syndrome. But he knows why he's doing what he's doing. So it's not necessarily fancy play, because it's what he perceives to be the best play. Someone's mic is still on. Okay. Any questions about that for the next hand? Good question. Is there any flop we don't c-bet? 998. Let's assume that, I mean, of all the flops that come, there are definitely flops that we can decide not to c-bet. But again, this is something that it's not a predetermined plan. I suppose the worst flop for a hand like this would be something like king, queen, jack, or ace, king, queen, or something like that. But then depending on the player, maybe say you know that he always reshoves an ace high preflop or something like that. So then how could he have top pairs in his range post-flop? Something like that. But I would say on really scary boards, you can check back, but it's checking back with the intention of exactly what he said, a delayed steal instead. So you can do things like delayed c-bets, but the reasons why you're doing them kind of mix with deciding and thinking and evaluating flop texture, opponent, stage of game, just the hand as a whole, things like that. So we're never checking giving up. We're checking, deciding, thinking, evaluating. Good question. Okay. Hand 2, I want to talk about regaining control and regaining confidence. When things aren't going well and stuff happens, start doing things you know are right, even if you sacrifice some plus maximum EV spot. So Marty, I don't know if you've seen this before. This is our code for something that's plus maximum EV versus something that's just plus EV. So in other words, the better of two good plays. That makes sense. So like in a situation where, just things aren't going well, and that maybe perhaps say with ace king here, it's better to min raise and call to induce worse hands to come along. There are some times when you can just say, okay, look, it's not going well. Let me just do something I know is good for sure. In other words, if you feel like you've kind of fallen down, get back on your feet again before you try and do something else. If you wanna dunk a basketball, don't try it right away. Try and just make a layup first. Don't just go for the dunk because it's maximum awesomeness or something like that. Work up to that point again, especially when just things aren't going well. Go back to normal things like shoving. And so that's why, in coaching sessions, we talk about why certain plays are better than shoving. But sometimes just go back to it. Do something you know is right for sure. Morton asks, Matt, do you think we can invent too much? Yeah, and that's the thing. It's that fancy play syndrome. If you're inventing plays, every time you do it, you should know why you're doing it, and you should know the specifics of why. Not just, oh, I know ace king is better because we get worse hands or something like that. But you should sense the players around you, the situation in the game, etc., etc. You should always have full control over what you're doing when you invent a play. So in a way, you can invent too much. And I think that's why it's important to always mix in just those normal plays. Go back to kindergarten poker where it's shove or fold, and to not get rid of shoving altogether. Marcus says, I went through this at some point in my experience here. Yeah, it's that idea of maybe it's too much. Like, you eat dinner, you're like, oh, chocolate sounds great for dessert. But you eat too much chocolate, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is starting to get gross. So maybe it's like a comfortable mixture of invention and some cool plays, but then a good mixture as well of just the normal regular plays. And I agree with Morton. Stage of the game is important when we invent plays. Yeah. And for me, I tend to invent plays more in the end of games, and do more normal plays like earlier on. Mark says, the point is you can't give up on deeply thinking each hand you decide to extract extra value. That's true. And that's why you maybe balance it by saving it to the end. I guess chocolate tastes better after dinner than in the middle of dinner, or like in the middle of the game when you can't actually get money at the middle stages of the game. Stupid chocolate dessert metaphors. Okay. Morton says, like at 600 or 800 blind level, don't invent too much. Just build our stack for final table. Exactly. And even invent less so in 180s at big blind 6 and 800 because you're further away from the money. It's like inventing is solve. Yeah, I mean, that's what's so cool about invention is it's open to interpretation. You can in poker, you can do anything. Like, any play can be okay as long as you understand why you're doing it. That's why people play so bad. They watch someone on TV that they love, like Tom Dwan, and then they try and copy him at the table. It's like, you don't know why he's doing what he's doing, so you're just copying. You know, whenever we invent a cool play, we should never be mimicking what we see. Morton says, but if you can invent on final table, you will do so great if you understand why. Exactly. But it doesn't mean that we should always invent, because sometimes you just gotta go back to basics and get your feet back on the ground. And that's something that I always did. Like, when I was losing or going through bad stretches, I would just go, okay, self, just do what we know is correct for sure. Let's get back to where we were before things started going bad. Let's just get back to that point. Yeah, and that's funny. Chris says that is the exact hand I was thinking of when I'm talking about this, where he had Queen 10 versus 4 deuce and aces. That's exactly the hand I was thinking of. That would never work in a sit and go, like, ever. The fighter that got knocked down and tries to stand up too fast. I like that. It's like, dude, regain your balance, man. You just got smacked in the face by like a downswing or something. Just get back on your feet again, get balanced, and then proceed to do what you do. Love that. Okay, so basically, as a reminder, as good as you get and as smart as you get and creative and good with inventing plays, you can't forget the roots of good sit and go play, which is simply push fold. You know, just because you're a genius at math doesn't mean you can forget how to add numbers together. Just because you can do calculus doesn't mean we should forget addition, because without addition, your foundation is destroyed. So never lose that foundation of push fold play. Always have that as an option. Confused what you mean, sir. But don't you think, logically speaking, it shouldn't matter? You mean it shouldn't matter if you go back to shoving? What do you mean? Yeah, okay. Yeah, because in theory, maximum EV plays will always be better than EV. I think what they're saying, Morton, is that I think I understand what they're saying is that shoving can sometimes not be worth the most. So they're saying, is it only an emotional aspect by why we consent to doing something that's not the best play? It is emotional. It's confidence. Because I think when you have confidence when you play, like, you guys know that feeling firsthand. Like, it doesn't matter how much you win or lose, whatever, you can tell when you're confident in game. And that's huge. And so if making a less EV play regains confidence, that's going to lead to more future EV, because the more confident you are, the better you're going to play. So maybe it's just like what Mark was saying about a fighter who's hit and he needs to get up first and regain composure before he can fight well again. And I think that's what this is here, is like, when you're going through a rough patch, go back to basics, even if that means less EV or something. So like a great example is here. This is a final table of a $3 or $7.45 man. I'm not sure which one is it, Morton. Either way here, this is a hand where, so $7.45 man, where Morton was thinking, oh, I would shove Queen Jack here, or I would shove Queen 10 suited here. And so I started thinking, okay, let's go back to basics. I think this is a snap shove. Only one person is short, and that really doesn't matter in a 45-man bubble because two people have to go out. So my question to you guys here is, what are we thinking about in basic push fold here? Like, what are the factors we are thinking about? Like stack depth, we'll just say number of big blinds, position, other stack sizes, and yours. Yeah, okay, so Mark got that. Effective chip stacks, stacks behind us. What else? picking up chips. Stats, blind level. And then I think ICM we could throw in there too. Hand strength. Can that go with? Yeah. Cool. Time blinds will go up. I think that's big in a 45 man because the next level is 12. Okay, so all these things, there's a lot of things. So of these things, let's do this. Hand strength, let's combine that with position here. Hand strength, position. Let's narrow these down. I'm going to take out some of these. I think these matter, but I'm going to make this simple. Other stack sizes in yours. Let's see. Let's include number of big blinds here because this is basically like shove ranges, hand strength, position, number of big blinds. ICM, let's take out this for now. Let's take out this for now. Let's take out stacks behind us because that's kind of included in other stacks. Can you guys rank these? Can we include edge in here? Sure, let's do that. Rank these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order of importance from best to worst. Edge over field, maybe. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order of what you think is most important to least important. Honest answer here. One, two, three, four, five. I like it. So he says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as well. Can you just put the numbers? I don't get confused. Like I see 1, 4, 2, 5, 3. That's what it feels like. Let's see what other people say. Puyan, what do you say here? This is really interesting because it kind of shows us where our priorities are when it comes to shoving and folding. Like, what are we actually looking at? So Mark says ICM, picking up chips, hand strength, position, number of big blinds, then other stack sizes in yours, and the edge over the field. That's so interesting. Yeah, like for me, the number one thing feels like number one, like by a million miles. And then Marcus says ICM. And ICM feels like the least important thing because it's a top-heavy payout. Wait, now I'm confused what Marcus is doing. It's okay, man. If you use Wiz, ICM is most important. That's true. So he changed it to that. I mean, Wiz is very flawed. We all know that. Marty, one thing that is very flawed with Sit and Go Wizard is that it's the independent chip model, meaning that it analyzes a hand independently of every other hand. But this game is not one hand. It's everything that's going to happen afterwards. So the independent chip model must be flawed. If that made sense. So I think we can agree that here, other stack sizes in yours is the most important. Let's focus on this one. So when we look at this particular game, because right now there's, how many chips are in play? Whatever 1,500 times 45 is. 65,000. Thank you, sir. Tomorrow's the 6th month, the half-year anniversary of Black Friday, and I still don't know how many chips are in play in a 45-man. Awesome. Can't believe tomorrow it's been half a year. Oh my god. But when we look, there's 65,000 chips in play. And when you get to a final table, there are so many ways that these chips can be distributed. In this particular game, how would you describe the chip setup? In just a brief little half sentence or something. Yeah, they have nice stacks behind. That's a good point, Chris. How would you describe the chip stack here in a couple words? Three bigs, one tiny. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Folding equity. That's so funny. These guys don't even seem big at all. Yeah, we do definitely. We will get folds over them. But see how, like, I don't know if this can cause anything, Puyon, but like when you think of other people as being big, psychologically, could that trick you into thinking that they have power or something like that? Just like psychologically, somewhere deep down or something. Okay, well, that's good. It's like, nope, I'm a baller. That's what she said. Three bigs, one tiny. I can't believe I said that. Okay. No, it is. It's a good way. It's a good way of explaining. It's recorded. So I see really like one tiny, and then since obviously 7 people make the money, one tiny makes no difference. Same thing, if this was for some reason, a final table of a 180 man, it still doesn't matter that that guy's short. ICM would suggest that it matters that that one guy is short. But then ICM would suggest to keep folding until he's gone. But if you did that, then you would miss out on all these expected value plays that put you in a better position to win the game. Even if, I think the only way to fold here would be maybe if there were 2 guys who had 1.5 big blinds or less. Thank you, Reb3186. Reb said that when people have 1.5 big blinds and less, that's a time where you can start being tight. But when people have 2.5 big blinds, it's not worth worrying anymore at all. People who follow ICM would be very tight here, but I think this is a snap shove. And if you look at the people behind, I think this is a spot where even 7-6 suited is a shove, because you just need to pick up a pot here. Otherwise, the blinds are going to hit 1,200, and you're just going to continue to fold. You can't shove in 3 hands. The blind might be 1,200. The big blind's going to be committed. Then the next hand, the guy's going to be all in there. Then the blinds hit you, and now it's just this spiraling effect where it's all downhill from here. In a vacuum, yeah, I think you could be wider than that for sure. Jack 9 suited, Jack 8 suited, 8-7 suited, Queen 9 offsuit, Queen 8 suited. It's like 40-ish% of hands with a bias towards good suited connectors. You are in it. But what it comes down to here is we have to know where our priorities are when we're thinking about shoving. We have to think about other stack sizes, picking up chips. But more importantly, I think like this, if we just treat this as where am I, what's my position, and number of big blinds, in a way that can kind of be good here, just going back to the very basics, because that's kind of a chippy V type of thinking. Like, hey, I'm in the hijack with 8 true big blinds, and I have Queen 10. I need to shove, because there's no reason why ICM should be making us tight here, because there's only one guy who's short. Other than that, it's anybody's game still, and we can't be timid just because one guy is short. Even if this was 8-handed, we should still shove, because the shortest stack will be 4 big blinds, and Reb said only be cautious when someone's at 1.5 big blinds or lower. So he folds. That guy raises. Okay. And remember this theme here. Remember, we said it before. As good as you get, Never forget why we do what we do. So then this hand, similar. Look, it's 8-handed. Now the blinds are up. Same exact hole cards. Same exact position. Yep. Now you have about 7-ish or 6.5 true big blinds. But look at the stacks. There's no stack that's less than 1.5 big blinds. They're one double up away from essentially being tied in the chip lead. There's no reason to be tight here at all. And look behind. Only one guy has more than us. And just because he has more than us doesn't mean we have to be careful of him. ICM, do you guys have a guess here of why ICM would recommend being tight in a spot like this, or somewhat tight? There's an exact mathematical reason why. It's the bubble. Okay, besides that, go a little deeper. He covers us, right? And so what does that mean if he covers us, Marty? What does that mean? Your chips are worth real money. That's good. Marty is pretty close here. He covers us. Right, he does have more chips, but mathematically, what does that imply? You do lose maximum value. I guess. It's pretty hard to min raise here because your stack is a weird kind of size. He can kick us out. Good. And what does that mean mathematically? If he has more than us and can kick us out, Marcus says, I think ICM takes in consideration we have a part of the money right now, but we are busted. But if we are busted, we get 0 money. That's exactly it. We lose all equity. Well said. You're such a poet. That's exactly why ICM suggests folding when there's guys who have more chips than you. But in reality, we threaten him just as much as he threatens us. Mathematically, though, he threatens us more than we threaten him because our equity goes to 0. And if you've heard before, the independent chip model overvalues small chip stacks. Completely. That's one of the flaws. It thinks you're worth way more money than you are. And so by the fact that you go to 0, you have nothing left. But if you were to go down to like 1,000 or something like that, ICM would think that your 1,000 is worth more than it really is. So that's the inherent problem with ICM here. 0 equity when you lose. So it says, oh my God, that means you're going to lose more than you think you are. Therefore, you have to be extra tight. But if we ignore ICM, because once again, remember, independent chip model means it has nothing to do with the next hand or the next hand, etc., etc. ICM, though, would suggest shoving the next hand very wide if you had more chips than everybody else. But it suggests folding in spots like this because your equity is going to go to 0 if you lose to the Chaos Fighter guy. But you see how that's flawed. Because ICM is saying you're not allowed to take a shove here in order to get the good shove on the next hand. Well, that seems illogical. Something good is going to happen tomorrow, guys, but you're not allowed to do anything to make sure that good thing happens. That seems weird and unfair. You can't do something kind of bad now in order to get something good tomorrow. They're saying tomorrow someone will give you $10. In order to get that $10, you have to lose $1 today. You're not allowed to ever lose money. You're not allowed to ever do something negative EV. That's against the rules. But if you do -1 now and get +10 tomorrow, you end up +9. But if you just fold here, it's, say, +2, because that's the plus EV play to make. What's better, 9 or 2? I went to kindergarten. 9 is greater than 2. You know, just a hypothetical example. That's why it's really important here. You can shove very wide here. You're stealing the chip lead here, essentially. I think in a spot like this, you could shove 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, 7-6 offsuit, 8-6 suited, Queen-5 suited, King-Deuce suited, even though it feels gross. Yeah. You're way too tight here, because if you shove this hand, you pick up the chip lead, and that's going to lead to more hands and more hands and more hands. And it's also going to increase folding equity now because you have everyone covered. And the more chips you pick up, the more likely in future hands you are to be the chip leader. It's a snowball effect. Exactly. You're picking up more snow as you roll. You're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a great metaphor right there. But if you never take this play to begin with, the snowball can never begin to get bigger. There has to be a starting point. And when you miss the starting point, you can't grow because you're going to have less opportunities. Someone's Skype is on. So just because it's the bubble, we can never be paranoid. Very wide in this spot. But remember, what it all comes down to is don't outthink yourself. Don't have a mental fancy play syndrome. Don't think you're not allowed to do this because of ICM or because you think you have to be relatively tight because it's the bubble. This is a clear example of a psychological fancy play. You are outwitting yourself. It's almost like the smarter someone is, the more likely they might be to fold this if they obey the rules. But then the dumber someone is, the more likely they might be to shove this. So don't fall victim to a psychological fancy play syndrome. You do. Exactly, Marty. That's a great point. Just because he has more than us, we still threaten the crap out of him. Just ICM interprets it as, since we go to 0 and he doesn't, that we have to be tight here. Conclusion, don't be smart. Be stupid. This is one of the biggest leaks that I had for probably the first 20, 30,000 games of my Sit-and-Go career, was giving way too much credit to the big stack or someone who had more than me, thinking that I couldn't go against him. When in all reality, you just want to go after that guy like crazy. Great hand. Really glad this hand came up. Really wide. And look, when you shove, oh my God, they gave a walk. Oh. They always give walks when we fold, when we should shove. But remember, it's just a shove. No fancy play, like min raise or anything like that. We're just going back to basics here. Putting yourself in a big stack position and ask yourself, what's your range? Oh, yeah, put yourself in Chaos Fighter's spot. And if Morton shoves right here, exactly, it's going to be a relatively tight range. Okay, couple more hands. Yeah, ace queen, maybe. Snap ace queen, snap that crap. Queon asks, do you think raise to call is part of fancy play syndrome? It is if you don't know why you're doing it in a certain spot. Because remember, it's not about the play that you make, it's about why you're making the play. So if you're just doing it, then it's fancy play syndrome. But if you know why you're doing it and why it's special in the moment, then it's not fancy play syndrome. Summary, you always have to know why you're doing something fancy. If you know the why, then it's a good play. If you don't know why, then you're just doing random things. Snap all of you with ace deuce. Snap you with 7 deuce. And see, Marty says something interesting here that he would call with like jacks and ace queen. And this is kind of like, I bet ICM here would suggest, especially if Morton had the chip lead here, ICM would suggest calling with like 10s plus or jacks plus. I think you would probably call here with like 9s or 10s plus and like ace queen plus. Something relatively tight. But if you knew that, say I was shoving here and you knew that I was shoving 5-4 suited, I mean, in theory, you could call with like king queen. ICM would laugh in your face if you called with king queen. And most of the time, I would never actually do that in game. But you could, because there's so much future value to picking up, I don't know, having 22,000 going into the money. That's huge. Kind of the idea of if we lose 2 points now and we gain 10 points later, then it must be plus 8 points overall. Yeah, I think something like 10s and ace queen or 10s and ace king is a really good range. Ace queen kind of feels iffy the more I think about it. So yeah, like 9s ace king, 10s ace king, maybe ace queen. Sounds good. Would I ever call king queen here? Maybe if I was inventing something, but that would take a very specific read in order to do that. Because a lot of regs will kind of obey ICM here in spots like this, so they're probably not as psycho as me, I guess. So I would call against myself, but maybe not a lot of others. Okay, let's talk about keeping it simple. It's the same game as this 8-9 offsuit from earlier. Kind of the exact same situation, actually. It's probably the very next orbit. And just a brief explanation. When we keep it simple and avoid fancy play syndrome, some people might find this fancy where you're raising and then you're bluffing flops, or you're check raising when you see, well, I guess you can't check raise in position, or raising when you see weakness on the flop. It's just important to remind ourselves that keeping it simple does not mean avoiding aggression. That's really important. That's something that Puyon and I talk about sometimes, is passivity versus aggression. And just because we're using stack preservation, or just because we don't want to be fancy and min raise with a bad hand and potentially bluff, it doesn't mean that we should just be passive to try and prevent fancy play syndrome. We can still be aggressive while we do easy plays. A great example. Let's say that you wanted to keep it easy, okay? So no fancy thoughts, no deciding, thinking, evaluating. Let's say we wanted to keep it easy. There's nothing wrong with just min raising here with a relatively decent hand like Jack 8 and c-betting the majority of flops. Even though we talk about it's better to decide and think and evaluate instead of just c-betting give up, c-betting giving up is probably better than open folding, because you're keeping it simple whether you fold or whether you raise and c-bet blindly. However, one of them is aggressive and one of them is passive. So even if two things are really simple, always take the aggressive line, because at least that gives you a chance to win chips. That was just a really, really simple hand right here. Any questions about that? Oh, sorry, raise to commit. Just saw that. Thank you, sir. Yeah, it just min raise fold. Keep it simple. And if someone calls and they check to you, c-bet blind. Obviously, we know that thinking about why we're doing what we're doing is way more important. But doing just a play, just to do it, we talk about, isn't the greatest thing, but it's definitely better than folding. Because at least there's some aggressive action on our part. We're active in the game. Yeah, always give walks. Oh. Okay, last hand. It's a very common expression that actions speak louder than words, and that's certainly true for a bajillion things in life. When it comes to poker, words or knowledge actually speak louder than actions. Because as you know, a lot of bad players can accidentally do the best play. You know what I mean? Like, some guy open jams ace queen for, I don't know, 15 big blinds, and someone calls him with ace 2, and all of a sudden he's a genius. You know, people can become geniuses on accident in poker, but then over time, all the guys who do it on accident, they slowly get hit with losses over time, you know. And that's why just because you make a good play doesn't actually mean it's the best thing, because we want to know why. If you can explain in words and if you have the knowledge to know why you're doing something, it's way better than if you actually do it or not. Because that means that usually over time you're going to do it. Like if you miss a spot one time, if you folded here with 8-jack or something, or if you just mucked pre-flop with 3s, one time, not a big deal, as long as you know all the reasons why we should do something, because that's going to influence future actions. So this is just an example of describing why something is fancy or why something is not fancy. Okay, so what do you guys do in a situation like this? We have about a little over 20x. The big blind has like a little under 30x. Okay, min raise. Anybody else? Okay, depends on him. Yeah, I guess you could do a fancy play if the time was right. You could limp, induce a raise, and then shove over, but you'd have to have a read in order to do that. and you would know why you are doing it, hopefully. Therefore, it wouldn't necessarily be fancy place syndrome. Puyon wants to limp stab and keep the pot under control. Totally fine. Big Nukes wants to limp if he's flatting. That's a good reason, because then if he flats, then the pot's larger and out of control. Marcus says sometimes limp. Big Nuke says we're going to bluff it if we see a flop with 3-3 anyway. That is really important. Really, really important. This is a perfect example of the sexy woman who's just a big illusion. Why do we raise this hand? Most people feel that you're really, really weak if you don't raise because it's a pair. It's a trick. It's a pair. You have the best hand pre-flop. But really, when it comes down to it, there's not a single flop you're going to like here unless you see one of the two remaining threes. And that's only going to happen about 12.5% of the time. So approximately a little less than 90% of the time, your hand's just going to be a big fat bluff, besides the small fact that you could check it down and maybe have the best hand. This is really important. Oh, 2-2-2 flop is a really good flop. That is true. I guess if you got, excuse me, if you got any XXX flop, XXX, it's probably a safe flop, but then you have to worry about future cards coming out. Marx has a good question. Do you treat it the same way as 7-5 offsuit? Essentially, this hand is 7-5 offsuit, because on any high card kind of flop, the only difference is in one, you could check it down and you have showdown value. That's it. That's it. But then you're relying on the strength of your hand. You're playing your cards if you do that. You know, we're not thinking about what he has, etc. 7-5 offsuit, I think, is better than threes, and I'll tell you exactly why. Let's just say they both flop like crap. Sure, that's totally fine. But when you understand why you're raising 7-5 offsuit, you're probably more likely to raise tons of other hands and give yourself value with tons of hands. If you don't raise 7-5 and you only raise threes, even though they can be the same hand, you're less likely to raise with bad hands, therefore miss out on tons of value in the future when similar types of hands come up. Because if you can convince yourself that threes equals 7-5, you're going to be way more likely to play hands in spots like this and get value. Warren says, like against a tight guy, don't give him opportunity to see a flop. Exactly. And then it would just be like a bluff, which is fine, but we have to recognize that. So what we've just talked about is, you know, why is something fancy? It's fancy if we go, dude, 7-5 equals threes. It's so abstract. Like, no, a lot of people say, no, it doesn't. But if you really understand that it does, because you're just going to raise, which he did, which is great. Then the guy calls. That's like the best flop on earth. But there's 22,000 flops. I'm pretty sure most of them are going to suck. 19,600 flops when you remove your 2 hole cards. Thank you, genius. That's not how you spell. There you go, Your Majesty. But now what, though? Think about this. We all bet this flop, I assume, right? I won't ban you. We bet this flop like, you know, 30-ish K, 25-ish thousand, something like that. Oh, check raising. Okay, that could be an option, because maybe you induce a bluff and then you have a good setup to check raise all in or something. Well, maybe. Or you could just check raise normal. Whatever. The point is that there's tons of flops where this hand is going to suck, so you might as well have 7-5 here. I mean, think about it like this. If you had 7-5 here, you could essentially check raise. Because if you had threes, you'd be screwed if the guy had a 4 anyway. You'd have 2 outs, so 10%. 7-5, I guess, would be dead, so that is a small exception. 7-5, you could check raise here. It'd be great, because he probably doesn't have something very much on this board. But you just recognize that threes is essentially a bluff versus most of the 19,600 flops, so why not just do it with 7-5? But it's not really fancy if you understand that. If you're just raising 7-5 to copy what we're doing here, then that's fancy, because you don't know why you're doing it. So that's kind of like why something is fancy versus why something is not fancy. So moral, if you understand the core reasoning behind what you're doing, that's a great point. Every turn is bad for us. If you understand the core reasoning behind what you're doing, then it's not fancy anymore. Never copy. Know why you're doing what you're doing. So Marty says check call for pot control. That's true. But then what about when he barrels the turn again? What about if he barrels the river? Yeah, that's a great point by Big Nukes. You can be fancy doing creative plays without doing fancy play syndrome, a fancy play with no reason. Cool. I like that. If you check call here for pot control, you're essentially allowing him to bluff, but then every turn card is going to be awkward for you. Now the turn comes an anything, I guess. I guess the higher it is, the worse it gets. You could check call though. It just gets really confusing. A good time to check call here would be like if you had say queens, kings, aces, because you still have most likely the best hand with one pair. However, the vulnerability of that pair is less because there's less overcards that can scare you. Yeah, let them catch up or something. But then when you have threes, it's just awkward. It's really, really weird. Morton says, can we agree that most hands in his range are broadways, ace-x, maybe some pair? You could, yeah. I mean, a lot of it comes down to his stack depth, but also his position. And in this position, he can have a lot of hands. I would say, say if you raised pre and someone flatted you from the small blind, or if someone flatted you from a position not in the blinds, then you could assume that their hands would be weighted more towards a conventional hand. Yes, we did raise pre. But when a guy's in the big blind, especially with his stack depth, he could call with a lot of hands here. Queen 5 suited could be in his range for all we know. Yeah, 10-4 suited because he's in the blinds, and that's something we have to consider. Whenever we're trying to hand read someone, we have to start with the basics, and that's what position did he flat you in? Because that's a clue. And then his stack depth is a clue too, like if he feels maybe he can afford it or not. Morton says, what do you say we should defend here? That's a really hard question to answer. You can definitely defend with a decent amount of hands, but the reasons to do it depend on how you analyze the player. Like Mark is saying, like where are you in the game flow. You know, in a vacuum, I would want to flat here with hands that flop well, like 9-10 suited or something. Like, just in a vacuum. Right. It is rare to be in a vacuum there, but let's just say for some reason you were like, I don't know, you have like this nightmare at night, and all of a sudden in your nightmare, you're playing this hand. Dude, I used to have nightmares of poker all the time. I'm not even kidding you. So then, like, you're just like, oh, I got to do something. Probably 9-10 suited, king, jack, king, queen, stuff like that. But there could definitely be more value in 3-bet folding those hands, maybe. You could also shove those hands, maybe. Like, there's tons of things we can do. Marcus says, wrote me an essay, says, do you consider open folding trash there in some specific situations when we're deep enough? And he's a reg with the intention of developing an image for future hands tourneys. Sometimes I try this when it's a please steal situation, and it seems sometimes they get tighter, more passive. There is definitely a reason to do something like that, because you know the why. You're assuming that this player is noticing you fold, and hopefully that'll make them tighter in the future. I don't think that's fancy play syndrome. It seems like a fancy play, but it's okay because you know why you're doing it. But you have to make sure that when you're doing it, it's against a guy who's going to notice what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just wasting chips. A good thing to do might be, like, assuming it's against a player capable of remembering, we're going to want to know how many tables they're playing at that time. You know, if it's the end of someone's set, they're probably more likely to notice because they have less games. We could always right-click on their name, and hopefully it says how many they're in. Um, but for the most part, don't get carried away in doing something like that because you really want someone to notice. If they don't notice, it never existed. And just remember, if someone is stacking their games and they get a walk, the table never pops up. So they will never even notice that that happened. Yeah, so Chris is saying sometimes he folds heads up to make the guy feel comfortable, and if I want him to think that folding the button is not bad. But that would assume that they're paying attention, and like you guys are kind of on a higher level right now. And it's really important to not overthink because now it's a psychological fancy play syndrome. Yeah, you're out leveling yourself. I think most people watch final tables, Marcus says, especially 180s. I agree. It's just a question of if someone's going to actually notice that and put that into their decision making process. And by the way, I heard a cool statistic once. Make it sound like it was a long time ago. It was last week. I was watching a show about memory, um, where they essentially it was an experiment where they staged a crime where like a man stole like a guy had like a bag over his shoulder, and then these two men stole the wallet from him, and there was a girl arguing with him, and the girl and the two robbers it was staged basically. Even the guy who got robbed, it was staged, right? But there were 12 people, the same amount as a jury, who were doing something else that it was like they were watching a 3-card Monte game, and that's what they thought they were there for, was to watch that. And so they staged a robbery, and then they had experts come in and question the people, right? Everybody gave different interpretations of what happened. But then there were people who would say, I would testify in court, basically, that this woman was wearing a white jacket or something when trying to establish who this woman was. And then basically they all gave their own interpretation of this. And then they were shown the video back and they were like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot this happened. Or she wasn't wearing a white jacket at all. Right. And the statistic that the guy who's like a professor on brain stuff at some fancy college said that the average short-term memory of a human being is 20 seconds. That means, in theory, after 20 seconds, a person will essentially forget whatever that thing was that happened. So if your play can do something within the next 20 seconds, sure, go for it. Stress levels make it worse. I could agree with that for sure. Huyon says, I remember back in the day playing 9-mans, and my friend told me that he did a loose shove and got called. Then he knows that I shoved loose because he saw me shove Jack 9. I told him he out-leveled himself because the guy's multi-tabling 20 tables. There's no way that the guy saw that. It's very true. Average short-term memory, 20 seconds. That's really important, especially you think about the level of competition. Bad players aren't going to remember, and the good players could remember, but they're going to be less likely to remember because they have so many other games going on. The most likely time when someone would remember is if it's a good player who doesn't have many games left and he can focus. So it's really important. Don't out-level yourself, even though there are definitely sometimes you can fold. But in summary, don't make psychological fancy play syndrome plays, essentially. I found that episode so cool. I don't know what it was called, though. It was on like National Geographic or something. 20-second average short-term memory. That is just amazing. Emotions make it hard to stay logical. That's very true. That's why sometimes it's easier to analyze things outside a game than when you're in game. You kind of get flustered, like stage fright or something like that. How people forget their lines on stage, you know, game fright or something like that. In the show I was watching, people were even getting things mixed up, things that were true, but then they got them flip-flopped. Like, for example, a guy said, the woman was wearing a red coat. I'm positive of it. But really, the man who got robbed was wearing a red coat. Mark says, stress increases performance, but too much makes it worse and makes them go back to basics. It's true. It's the difference between people who thrive under pressure and people who crumble under pressure. You know, when you actually are given the opportunity, then what? You know, it's when you're actually in the moment, it's really hard to pull off. So I think when you guys are making folds like that, it can be okay sometimes, but most of the time, it seems you're falling victim to a psychological fancy play syndrome. Just don't give walks, whatever. Just shove everything, get lucky. So, summary of everything. Fancy play is not necessarily the same thing as fancy play syndrome, because a fancy play, you would know why you're doing what you're doing, and just think more in the moment. And when it comes down to it, if you're ever struggling, just go back to basics. Shove that, shove that, min raise that, and just c-bet if you're confused. Know that this is a bluff when you're doing it. So raise lots of hands and just c-bet. Keep it simple. Oh, yeah, we didn't look at what he did. Cool. Just raise and keep it simple and just c-bet a flop. When things aren't going so well and you want to just get back up on your feet again. That is it. Any final questions? The internet did not go out. What? I'm stoked. Winning. What is that like? Charlie Sheen? Winning. So Morton, I want you to go back to basics. Get back on your feet again. Yeah. Marty's right. Make a move to an easy decision. And Marty, like we'll talk later today on our first coaching. You're going to find over time that the easy decisions are not necessarily the best decisions, but there are times when we should just make that easy decision. Thank you, Marcus. Yeah, Chris, be a fish again. Yeah, I think Mark, fully focused, said it good. You know, put yourself together again, like a fighter being knocked down, like by a downswing, and then just get back up on your feet. You know, fancy play versus fancy play syndrome. Man, how advanced is the world where now there's smiley faces or whatever faces that have tears? Come on. Who invented the smiley face? That must have been worth money. Okay. I think that's it, Puyan. I'm going to hang up this call.